July 3rd meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission. My name's John Borofsky, and I am the chair for today. I'd like to go around the room and introduce ourselves.
I'm Kristen Taylor.
I'm Chris Ramey.
Lisa Fragola.
Tiffany Edwards.
Bill Randall.
Stephen Baker.
Great. First thing I'd like to do is welcome our newest members. We have 3 new members and 1 member that was reappointed to another 4-year term, Commissioner Taylor. Welcome. Thank you for your public service. If you'd like, it would be nice if you could just kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about, tell the world a little bit about yourself and your whatever you want to say at this point. That would be really nice. We'll start with Chris.
Well, Kristen doesn't, because she's already here. So.
Kristen can start.
Oh, you want me to start?
I guess. Yeah, you're the...
Okay. I live in the Fairmont Neighborhood Association. I have a background in architecture and planning. And I work for a local firm. And I'm very thoughtful about recusing myself and making sure that I'm representing the city at large, and I take that really seriously. And I am happy to be here another 4 years and serve the community.
Great.
I'm Chris Ramey. I was born, raised, and educated in Eugene. I'm practicing as an architect and a planner. I recently was at, well, not that recently ago, a few years ago, was at the University of Oregon finishing a 30-year career in master planning, campus planning, design. I ran the campus planning office and the real estate office and sustainability department while I was there. Having grown up in Eugene, I really understand the special nature of Eugene, and I look forward to continuing to push that special nature forward so that my children and their children can enjoy the same benefits that I did. I feel that public service is a part of being a good citizen, and it's a part of being in Eugene, and I learned that growing up in Eugene. So I'm really looking forward to serving in this committee and working with this great team here and a great team of staff members. And I am also from the Fairmont neighborhood, and that's where I grew up.
Great.
My name is Lisa Fragola, and I live in the Friendly Area neighborhood. I'm a 2nd grade teacher at Adams Elementary, and I'm really excited to be part of the Planning Commission. As a 2nd grade teacher, I spend a lot of time with kids and families and think of myself as an ally to them, and I look forward to helping to work on issues that will build the city that we need to make sure that all families in the city have access to affordable housing, parks and recreation areas, and safe ways to get to school. So excited to be here. Thank you.
Again, Tiffany Edwards, and I do policy work for a local nonprofit representing the business community here in Eugene. I'm a native Oregonian, but I came from on the other side of the mountains, and I've been here for about 6.5 years. I feel as though the work of the Planning Commission is extremely valuable to our community and critical to how we look at where we're going to be in the future. Public service is also something that is very important to me, and I firmly believe that we should all lend our time and talents where we are able to. So, yeah, I'm just really excited to be here, so thanks.
All right. Thank you. Welcome. We will be seeing more of each other as time goes on. So we're here today to deliberate on the Furtick Family Limited Partnership, PDT 17-4 and ARA 17-15. We have a few procedural things to go through at the beginning here. It's a little bit unusual because we had the public hearing at a point where these 3 commissioners hadn't been seated yet, but it's my understanding that they've all viewed the tape of the public hearing and have had all the materials available to them. So at this point, I'm going to have Lauren talk to us about ex parte communications and if there's any conflict of interest that people need to raise.
Great. Thank you, Chair Borowski. Because the 3 new planning commissioners were not present at the public hearing, we just want to make sure to give them the opportunity to declare any bias, ex parte contacts related to this application, or conflicts of interest. And I'll just kind of go down the line and ask you to take it one by one. So, Commissioner Ramey, do you have any bias, ex parte contacts, or conflict of interest to declare?
I do not.
Perfect. Commissioner Fragola, do you have any bias, ex parte contacts, or conflict of interest to declare?
No, I don't.
Great. Commissioner Edwards, I'll ask you about ex parte contacts and conflict of interest first. Do you have either of those things to declare?
No, I do not.
Okay. And the reason that I saved bias for last is because at the public hearing, a member of the public did challenge your ability to be impartial. And so I just want to ask you a couple of questions about your ability to make an unbiased decision on this application. So, let me see. Do you have the ability to set aside any personal views and to make an unbiased decision on this appeal based solely on the record before the Planning Commission and the applicable approval criteria?
Yes, I do.
Great. In that case, that takes care of that issue. As part of the challenge to your impartiality, Jason Brown asked to submit some evidence into the record, which we will deal with a couple of steps from now. So I don't want people to think that that got lost. And then I want to confirm, it sounds like I saw head nods from all 3 new commissioners that you have all watched the public hearing and that you have had access and the opportunity to review the materials in the record to date.
Yes.
Perfect. And then I also wanted to point out, just for those watching, that we have a physical copy of the record on this application here in front of the Planning Commission tonight.
All right, great. So that checks box number 1. Box number 2 is, at the last public hearing, we omitted to close the record. So at this time, I would entertain a motion to close the record on this.
So moved.
And is there a second? Any discussion about this?
Does this affect some of the materials that you were exposed to briefly? May or may not have been submitted as part of the record to the hearings official or prior. Does this affect that at all?
Commissioner Baker, no. So the only materials that have come into the Planning Commission following the public hearing are the, late this afternoon, the applicant submitted a memo objecting to some of the evidence that was presented at the public hearing. No other record materials have come in. And so we'll go through the new evidence issues related to evidence submitted at the public hearing as soon as we close the record.
Okay.
All right. So with that being said, all those in favor of closing the record, raise your hand. It's unanimous. Okay. Tick. All right. The next item we have is there was some discussions about evidence that was presented at the public hearing, and we were going to get back to us on whether there was new evidence, whether it's arguments, and Lauren is going to help us with that as well.
Thank you again, Chair. I don't always talk this much for the new planning commissioners. So there were some documents that were presented to the Planning Commission during the public hearing, and there were some questions from the commission itself, as well as then objections from the applicant about some of that material being either new evidence or new argument that was not presented to the hearings official. And by way of background, in an on-the-record appeal such as this, our code says that the Planning Commission does not accept new evidence. The Planning Commission is limited to evidence that was provided to the hearings official. That the appellant has to identify specific appeal issues, and the Planning Commission is limited to consideration of those appeal issues. The Planning Commission doesn't get to kind of say, oh, but I also think the hearings official messed up over here. If it's not identified by the appellant, that's outside of the scope of your review. And our code also says that the arguments on appeal need to have been raised before the hearings official. There can't be a brand new argument that's raised on appeal to the Planning Commission. So that's just kind of background to this discussion. Those who have been on the Planning Commission for a while have recently been through a bunch of evidence challenges in a separate appeal. And I just wanted to let you know that there are kind of different ways to handle new evidence issues. One way, and the way that you experienced in the other application, is to sort of do it surgically, to look through documents and say, I believe that this paragraph or this sentence, in some cases this word, is new evidence or new argument, and reject that specific bit. Another option is to say that a document contains new evidence to the point where Planning Commission would like to reject the entire thing. The applicant has asked that Planning Commission reject everything that was submitted at the public hearing other than the copy of ORS 40.090, which was submitted by Jennifer Jonek, and an order from the Lane County Commission that was also submitted by her, and the accompanying deed, which is already in the record. So applicant does not object to those two documents, the statute and the order, but does object kind of across the board to everything else. Planning Commission can decide to reject documents in their entirety, can decide to reject kind of individual pieces of documents. Staff have gone through the documents to determine whether things are already in the record or not, and also to determine whether, we think that information in those documents could be construed as new evidence or new argument. But ultimately, it's up to the Planning Commission to decide whether you want to consider those things or reject them. So that's sort of background. Oh, you already have enough? So something that may be helpful to your consideration is the definition of evidence that's taken from the Land Use Code. Evidence is defined as facts, documents, data, or other information offered to demonstrate compliance or non-compliance with the standards believed by the proponent to be relevant to the decision. So when we talk about new evidence, that's what we're talking about. That was not presented to the hearings official. And I thought we could, and I will also say, it's been a little bit tricky because you haven't seen most of these documents. The documents submitted by the applicant were passed out to planning commissioners at the public hearing for a brief time, but we collected them back from you. And the other documents were never actually presented to you, so you haven't seen them. But in order to help you make your decision about whether or not they actually constitute new evidence, we'll be publishing them up on the screen for you so you can at least see what we're talking about. I thought we could start with the email string that Jason Brown asked to be included in the record. That was clearly not before the hearings official. It's an email string that has to do with a completely separate land use application. The planning staff has looked through the record to confirm, but it is true that it was not presented to the hearings official. So our advice would be that Planning Commission reject that email string. It's also not really specific to any of the appeal issues or to this application. This was the email string presented in accordance with the challenge to Commissioner Edwards' impartiality. So I think it would be helpful to the parties to clarify that Planning Commission will not be considering this email string as it considers the merits of the appeal and the application.
Okay. Commissioner Taylor.
So do you need a motion to move that forward?
Yes.
Is that the intention?
Yeah, that would be great.
I move to strike this document from the record or not included in the record as it applies to the appeal.
Great.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
I was just curious, is this email streamed solely on the Capitol Hill PUD?
All right.
I just wanted to clarify that
Yeah.
farther down, because all we're seeing is the first page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Did you vote?
Yes, it was all, it was
Unanimous.
Okay,
unanimous.
sorry.
Thank you. So then the next document is a letter from Bill Blix and Katie Dixon. There's a one-page letter, and then a bunch of documents are attached to the letter. And so again, the applicant has asked that you reject this letter. The applicant's motion doesn't get into a lot of detail about why individual pieces of, why the applicant believes individual pieces of information should be rejected. Staff did a review of the letter, and in staff's estimation, it appears to be more of an argument than new evidence. The specific claims in the record are at least somewhat supported by evidence in the record before the hearings official. So the letter is kind of the first piece of that, and then we can go individually through the attachments. It is clear that some of the attachments were already in the record before the hearings official, and some of them weren't. And so I think those that were not in the record before the hearings official, in staff's estimation, do constitute new evidence. Those that already are in the record, and you can consider them.
And so just for the commission's knowledge, if we do decide to take some of these into the record, what we're planning on doing tonight is doing straw polls on each of the four appeal issues. So rather than stopping and going through and reading through all of these, if we bring them into it, we will make them available. And then if on Thursday, when we meet to do the final decision, if we want to reopen any of those straw polls that we took based on some of the things that you saw there, we will have that opportunity to do that at that point.
Are you opening it up for questions
Yep.
at this point? So I guess my question would be, obviously, if there are parts of that that were not in the record, we reject that. But the parts that were in the record, if they're resubmitting things that were already in the record, does the cover letter then kind of support that as far as argument? You were saying the letter is really more argument than it is evidence. And I guess if someone is presenting an argument based on a document that's already in the record, it seems like that's fair game.
I agree.
So, so it sounds like there's a little bit of both in there in your estimation?
Yes, I would say, in my estimation, and ultimately it's the commission's decision, it appears to me that the letter is argument based on evidence that's already in the record. Some of the exhibits to the letter are not in the record, and I believe that those are new evidence that Planning Commission should consider rejecting.
Commissioner Baker, and then Taylor.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time reading the record, and based upon those paragraphs, that's all right in the record. I mean, unless there's more in this letter that's substantially different than that material, that's, a lot of that is like direct quotes right out of the record, so I can't have any objection to that.
Commissioner Taylor.
Obviously, we haven't had a chance to review these documents. I guess my only question would be, is there argument within the cover letter that actually supports some of the attachments that actually aren't in the record? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense, and I don't believe so.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So what we'd be looking at, sorry.
Yeah.
So what we'd be looking at then is bringing in or allowing all of it except the attachments that aren't in the record.
Yes.
And those will have an opportunity to
And then we'll have an opportunity to review.
those as well.
So, and I can sort of, maybe we can kind of quickly walk you through the attachments. So the first page is,
It's kind of a statement of different materials. It's basically a statement of exhibits that were attached to this letter. There's no real argument in this specific, first attachment to the letter.
and this document itself is not in the record.
Right, and the document itself is not on the record.
The next page,
I'd have to differ because some of that text comes right out of the record.
Well, what we're saying is that this statement itself, taken as a whole, is not in the record
I know,
as a
but
statement.
The text comes right out of the, talks, I have yellow stickers here, and I've read where it talks about this, some of this stuff.
Well, yeah, and so what I'm saying is that some of this is describing lots of materials that are attached in the exhibits. Some of the exhibits are in the record, and so the material in this page, talking about the exhibits that are in the record, would be admissible. But those that reference exhibits that aren't already in the record are not.
so the commission has an option in this particular document. You could decide to go through with a fine-tooth comb and say, well, I think that this is really argument related to something in the record. To me, it appears that this is a new document that is not currently in the record. It does reference some record materials, but it itself is newly created and has, going back to that definition of evidence, is facts, documents, data, or other information offered to demonstrate compliance or non-compliance with the standards believed by the proponent to be relevant to the decision, and is not currently in the record. So to me, this appears like this document itself is new evidence. Some of the documents that it references are not and are already in the record. Commissioner.
Is this time, can I make a motion?
Sure.
Or do you want to go exhibit by
Well,
exhibit?
let me
Yeah.
give Commissioner.
Thank you. I just had a quick question. Does the evidence have to specify that it's addressing one of the particular issues? Or it can just be,
That's a good, one of the appeal issues?
right, one of the appeals?
That's a good question, Commissioner Edwards. It is helpful to the commission and to staff when folks do that. It's not a legal requirement.
All right, now Commissioner Taylor.
I would like to make a motion to reject this piece of evidence.
Second.
Second. For discussion, for me, kind of what Commissioner Baker said, that a lot of this stuff is in the record, so I'm seeing it anyways. So for me, I don't know if I need to jeopardize having, new evidence being put before us when a lot of the things that we would be able to see if we went through and poked line by line by line, we've already seen or have been brought up. So I don't have a problem with omitting it. Commissioner Randall.
And I guess my only concern with that is if there is like a cover letter referencing exhibits and we reject the exhibits that aren't in the record and then we've already accepted the stuff that's in the record, my concern is if that cover letter has argument within it that refers to items that are in the record that are pertinent to the appeal issues, then it seems like we should allow that. So I'm not sure, for me, rejecting the whole thing, I mean, granted, it's there anyway, but if somebody has the opportunity to make an argument based on those issues, I think they should have that opportunity.
Commissioner Taylor.
So I guess I have a question, and this is probably good for, especially, as this gets more complicated, let's imagine we have a 5,000 page. I mean, this is quite a large record also. Really our capacity to look word for word and start striking separate words, which is essentially what you're insinuating. So I guess what it's a question to legal counsel. How do we address this?
At the end of the day, it's really up to the commission. I think what I can do is kind of direct you back to that definition of evidence, direct you back to our code requirements that say no new evidence, that you should only be considering evidence that was before the hearing's official. Remind you that if you do decide to open the record to new evidence, then other folks need a chance to respond to that new evidence. And in this particular case, we are very tight on time because the Planning Commission needs to make a decision within 120 days under state law, and that 120 days expires on July 7th. There's not really time to reopen the record, allow folks to weigh in on new evidence, let them know that they can, all of that, and still make a decision before the 7th.
Okay. Commissioner Randall?
And I wasn't suggesting that we reopen the record at all, and I wasn't suggesting taking in new evidence. I guess my concern is if it's an argument related to something that's in the record pertinent to an appeal issue, it would really be no different than coming to the public hearing and testifying to that effect. And so my feeling is, and I know it can get a little messy and surgical,
right,
pulling out the attachments that don't apply, because I absolutely think we should do that. But then allow what is there, even though it might be duplicative with what we've already heard and what we already know, it seems like it still gives that person a voice.
So
If it is in the, if it is
Yep.
an appeal, if it's an issue in the record that's.
So can
there.
I clarify, Commissioner Randall,
Yeah.
just to be clear? This is only the first in a number of attachments. Maybe it would be helpful for Planning Commission if we went through each of the attachments and told you what is currently in the record and what is
Are
not.
we just talking about the first, because you said there was like a cover letter and then 27
Yep.
attachments.
So you have made a
We're just talking
motion.
about that first, not the whole 27.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. I was
Yes.
just
So we're just talking about this, what's on the,
Okay.
on the thing right
No.
there.
I was
And there is a
misunderstanding.
motion and a second on the floor to omit it.
Okay.
So the discussion is to this page here. Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I'm concerned because we're going through this letter, which seems mostly to me to be argument based upon other documents. And yet we're not doing the same thing for testimony. I mean, we had the same thing with testimony that was presented at the hearing, and we didn't reject any of that testimony. I feel uncomfortable if someone wasn't able to be there and they sent a letter, and it seems to be mostly argument, not new evidence, and we could remove the evidence, why we would strike this and not go back and say, okay, now we're going to look at this testimony by the, these people and the applicant's testimony, which certainly would have things that we would have to eliminate because they weren't in the record. So we have a sort of a strange, I don't understand the logic.
I appreciate your point.
Commissioner Taylor?
Can you go back to the definition of evidence? So this is kind of my understanding. When we take a look at, so evidence is facts, documents, data, or other information offered to demonstrate compliance or non-compliance with the standards believed by the proponent to be relevant to the decision. So if indeed the document has repetition, if some of the evidence on that sheet of paper has information that's already in the record, it's going to be in the record because they are facts, documents, data. An argument has to support what's already in the record. So what I'm hearing from staff is that that document has actual facts, documents, or data or other information that's actually not in the record. So for me, that means we've got to reject it. Otherwise, what we're going through is like line by line. And if there's a portion that has facts, documents, data that's already in the record, it's already in the record. So we're not going to lose that. Now, argument's different, and if it's blended all together, I find we don't have time to open up the record. I think then that's a different thing. But I'm hearing that from staff's opinion, we haven't gotten into argument. It was the first page has argument. We now have a summary of what's included in terms of the exhibits. So obviously, the summary is going to have some new evidence because there's some exhibits that are actually clearly facts, documents, data, or other information that's not currently in the record. So that's, it's, to me, if we keep it clean, keep it clear and clean, like removing something that actually is already there, we have that information in terms of facts, documents, and data. And I did see some lists of plans, for instance, dates, et cetera, that are not in the record, and that we can't consider that, even in an argument.
Okay, I'll give Commissioner Baker one, and then I'm going to call for the vote.
Yeah, maybe it would be better if we looked at the attachments.
This was the
So we can
first
verify-
attachment.
Pardon? No, but the other attachments that are, or if the staff could point out in this what item is not in the record, then, I mean, I looked at it, and maybe the comment by Jerry Rust, but I don't know, I wasn't, you know, again, I just looked at it briefly, but, I mean, I spent a lot of time looking at the record from the hearings official prior for this reason, because I knew we had these concerns about whether it's in the record.
Okay, so when I was going through the record and the evidence submitted, I created a list. It goes exhibit by exhibit. If you'd like me to walk through the list, I can do that.
Well, no, just
Yeah.
what is not in the record in this particular.
Okay.
Well, Commissioner Baker, again, I would say that this document itself is not in the record. The document that's up on the screen right now.
Oh, I know the document, but what information in the document is not in the record? In other words, I mean, this whole thing about the quitclaim deeds is there.
Right.
The reaffirming the T2000 plan, that's there. The Spring Boulevard overpass, the transportation improvement plan.
The transportation improvement plan is not in the record.
What? I know, but there's reference to it in the, I mean, there's similar text in the record.
Okay.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, the transportation improvement plan is, but there's very similar text to that in the record. That sentence looks to me like it was pulled out of one of the comments from one of the participants in the hearings official letters that were received.
Well, so, okay, this statement of text, and we'll use the transportation improvement plan as an example, that's referring to a specific exhibit that is further down. And that exhibit is not in the...
Transportation improvement plan was not submitted as part of the record, but this text was there before, is what I'm saying.
Okay, what I'm saying is that this is identifying a further down exhibit, and the exhibit that it's referencing isn't in the record, and it's not the entire plan. The exhibit is not the entire plan. It's a little snippet of the plan, and this is the identifier for that exhibit.
All right, so at this point, I'm going to call for the vote on the motion to not accept this into the record. All those in favor? Opposed?
I'll abstain because
Abstain.
I'm sure
Okay.
until I see the...
All right, let's move on to the next exhibit.
The next exhibit is in fact in the record. It's located at page 515, this rendering of the project area. The following exhibit, which is page 4 of the document, a letter to Sally Weston from Public Works, is not in the record.
Do you want us to take votes on these one at a time?
Yeah, let's
Okay,
just do it that way.
so let's go back to the rendering.
But I don't think you need to vote on the rendering because
Okay,
it's
so
already
that's
in the record. It's- yeah.
Okay. Next one is this letter, which staff has told us is not in the record.
I move to reject the letter in front of us, dated March 12th, this exhibit that's in front of us, rejected from the record.
Discussion? All those in favor? Okay.
Is there a second?
Yeah.
You're good.
Commissioner Randall seconded. All right.
This April 4th memorandum, dated April 4th, 1980, is also not in the record.
Okay, I'll go ahead and do this. I move to reject this exhibit in front of us, it's dated April 4th, I think. Rejected from the record.
I'll second.
All right. Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? One.
I was aye.
Oh, you were aye, okay.
The next exhibit is an order from the Board of County Commissioners that is in fact in the record already on page 518, so we can just move past that.
You can leave that one.
Yep. The next page is a specific page from the FY 1980-81 Transportation Improvement Program. That is in the record at page 517, so that can stay.
Okay.
The next page is a cover page from the Eugene Springfield Area Transportation Improvement Program. That is not in the record.
Okay.
Move to reject.
Second.
Great.
All those in favor? Unanimous?
The next item is a letter to William Fry, and that is not in the record.
I move to reject this piece of evidence from the record.
Second.
All those in favor? Okay.
The next item is a screenshot of a memo from Mike Evans to the City of Eugene traffic engineer dated April 26, 1996. It is not in the record.
Move to reject.
Second.
Second? All those in favor? Mr. Taylor, seconded.
Thank you.
The next item is a copy of the official record of descriptions of real properties. It is also not in the record.
I move to reject this piece of evidence from the record.
Second.
Is that the real property that is Lot 301? Because there is a description of Lot 3.
Yeah, but it doesn't look like this document.
It's not
Right,
this.
it looks pretty similar to that.
It looks pretty similar to, and there's actually a couple of different copies of it in there too, that are slightly different.
Just a question. Is it?
It is not the same document.
Okay, all right. I just, I was looking up at it here, and it was hard for me to read, so.
It regards the same parcel, but is not a document that's in the record.
Okay. Motion to strike?
I think we already did.
Taylor made one,
Oh, okay.
Edward seconded.
All in favor? Okay.
The next item is a copy of the quitclaim deed. That is in the record at page 519. The next item is again, another copy of official record of descriptions of real properties. Is not in the record.
Move to reject.
Second.
All those in favor?
Great. And then we have a few items in quick succession that are included in the record, a couple of screenshots from Eugene City Council meetings, a draft Goal 5 Riparian Upland Wetland Habitat Site map, and a photo of the project area. Then we have photos from the Metro Plan diagram. Those are not in the record.
Is this the current Metro Plan diagram?
I don't know the answer to that question. Do you know?
Can't see that.
But the point is that it's the Metro Plan diagram, it's, you can't reject it.
Well, remember, we have to go back to a historical decision that we made, and the actual adopted plan, if it's been copied or more, remember, we got into the detail of it, so it's really important that we make sure we have the right one.
This is not the official one.
Yeah, it's not the
official
It's
adopted
from
one.
2010.
Move to reject.
Second?
yeah.
Is this the current Metro Plan?
It is not.
2010.
No.
All those in favor?
Actually, the current is.
I do.
Oh, thanks.
The next item is a notice of intent for Spring Connector multi-use path. That is not in the record.
I move to strike.
Second.
All those in favor? Okay.
And then finally, a letter dated April 6, 2010 from Neil Bjorkland, Eugene Parks and Open Space, and it is not in the record.
Motion to strike?
Is there a second? Okay. All those in favor?
Great. Okay.
So at this point, I just want to make a quick comment because Mr. Blix is in the room, and I just want to say that this is a procedural thing. It looks like you did a lot of work on this. Don't take it personal. This is just kind of.
I will.
Just, I appreciate all the work, and if it had been in the record, we definitely would have taken notice of it.
Yeah, I know. And in the record or out of the record just gets monotonous. You know, it's really hard for us citizens to deal with. And just as a point, the deck is stacked, you know, against citizens. In my mind, you know, as a private citizen, to try to come up with arguments and research that will do justice to any argument in this is just damn near impossible. So.
All right, thank you. Yes.
Did we make a decision on the very first document? I mean, we looked at the second document, had a long deliberation about that, but I don't believe we ever made a decision about the first one.
We decided-
The cover
decided
letter?
The cover letter, you did not, actually.
No, I
Yeah,
thought
we
we
did.
decided to take it in, didn't we?
We
Oh, maybe you didn't.
Well,
there was the recommendation from staff that it was acceptable, but I don't think we made a decision on it.
No one made a motion to reject it. So as long as if it's placed before you and not rejected by you, then it's part of the record.
Okay,
So
thank you.
if Planning Commission wants to reject it, we'll need a motion. If you don't need to reject it or don't decide to reject it, then you
Then
don't
it
have to do
stays part
anything
of the
and it
record.
automatically
Great,
becomes part
thank
of
you
the
for
record.
that clarification.
Thank you. All right, next set of,
Yeah, a few more documents. Okay, so the applicant also presented the Planning Commission with 3 documents, a highlighted copy of Senate Bill 1051, a highlighted portion of the Eugene Code relating to tentative PUD requirements, and a highlighted copy of the Parkview Terrace LUBA decision. The applicant, in his letter to the Planning Commission this afternoon, indicated that applicant believes that those are not new evidence, that they are rather law, but that if Planning Commission determines that they are either in and of themselves new evidence or due to that highlighting and underlining, Planning Commission feels that they rise to the level of new evidence, the applicant does not, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but object to, if Planning Commission decided not to consider them,
they're okay.
that would be okay.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, there were a number of LUBA cases cited in the record prior to that, but this one is not cited to my knowledge.
I believe that's accurate.
So I feel that we should not say we'll accept any LUBA
Oh, that's not.
decision unless it's previously been mentioned in the record. Otherwise,
Commissioner Baker, I apologize. Actually, the applicant did cite to the Parkview case. You don't have a copy of the decision in the record, but there is a citation to that decision on page 52 of the record.
that was before the hearings official.
That was the applicant's final response. So yes, it went to the hearings official.
Okay, any discussion on whether you guys want to use these as deliberative documents?
I think I was the one that originally mentioned at the public hearing the concern that I had about it being highlighted and underlined. And, you know, I don't know if that's really a valid argument not to accept it in, but it sounds like the applicant is fine if we don't. So I could go either way.
I guess I'd love to hear some from staff, some precedent.
So I'll be candid with the commission. I looked for, guidance from the Land Use Board of Appeals or other bodies about does underlining and highlighting constitute new evidence, and I did not find anything particularly on point. I think that again, I keep kind of throwing it back in your laps, but I think it is ultimately a question for the commission looking back at the definition of evidence, and determining whether, highlighting and underlining it kind of rises to the level of new evidence, or whether maybe it doesn't feel like it does anything for you, or maybe whether it feels more like argument because your attention is being directed to a particular passage in a legal document. I leave it up to the commission.
So I put myself in the queue. For me, the highlighting doesn't represent new evidence. To me, that it would be the same as somebody standing up at the public testimony and directing me to page 3 of this. It's just kind of the same way. It's just, I think, was a something that was done to help the Planning Commission make their deliberations, so I don't have any problem with it. Commissioner Randall.
And I guess something that, as we've been talking about this, it's really no different also than quoting something and then putting that either in bold or italics and saying emphasis added, that kind of thing. And that's certainly something that we've always allowed, so.
Mr. Baker.
Yeah, the reason I didn't think that this was considered part of the record was that it was the response to the open record period, which I assumed was considered argument rather than you couldn't submit new evidence as part of the response.
I'm not sure I understand your question,
Well,
Mr. Baker.
page 52. In other words, the Luba case that's cited there
Oh, I see.
is only mentioned in the response after the 7-day record period was closed.
As part of the applicant's final argument.
Final argument, so you shouldn't be able to submit new evidence as part of the final argument. That's why I was concerned about that particular document.
I think that's an accurate statement, Commissioner Baker. I guess the question for the commission is whether the commission believes that these documents, copies of state law, a copy of a LUBA decision, a copy of the code, it constitutes evidence, and in particular, new evidence. And I think probably, it's up to you.
It's up to the commission. So.
But I think one could make a distinction between evidence, factual assertions, and the law.
So let's just go through these one at a time. The Senate Bill 1051, does anybody have a leaning of whether or not to bring that in or take it out?
You're talking about the copy of the Senate bill.
The copy of
It's been highlighted and underlined.
that Attorney Reader
Just for
presented to
I think
us.
it might help because they weren't
Right.
there,
Senate
so
Bill
they didn't actually
1051
see
is
it.
in the record. And this is a
Nah.
copy of Senate Bill.
It's not in the record.
Right.
Senate Bill 1051 was not mentioned in any testimony or any.
Well, the text of Senate Bill 1051 is not in the record. I don't know the record well enough to speak to whether it was ever mentioned.
I looked through pretty thoroughly and I didn't see any specific references to SB 1051. But that being said, they're kind of interchangeable terms used for this. And the most often used term is the needed housing statute. The exact text, SB 1051, I didn't see on the record.
But the needed housing statute was referenced,
Needed housing statute is referenced often throughout the record.
and
And a good portion of 1051 deals with needed housing.
yes.
Commissioner Baker?
I was going to say also there was some ORS statutes that were referenced, and I don't know if those were related.
So in the discussion of needed housing statutes, I think there are some citations to the ORS provisions, and I believe that those ORS provisions correspond with SB 1051.
Okay. Yes?
Personally, I don't think it really matters that it's Senate Bill 1061 was the Senate bill, but the ORS regulations are really what govern in this case. It doesn't really matter what the Senate bill says. it's the regulations that were adopted that really matter. So it doesn't really matter to me, but it doesn't seem crucial that you have to accept it or reject it.
The other thing that if I may, I would point out for the commission is that Senate Bill 1051 in particular is specific to arguments related to needed housing. Those are not, none of the appeal issues deal specifically with needed housing. And so that is outside of the scope of your review in terms of looking at the appeal issues and whether the hearings official made a mistake or not. So to the extent that that matters, I mean, I don't know that you need to reject it.
Commissioner Edwards.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. I think a Senate bill as a standalone doesn't necessarily imply that it's a bill that's been put into, case law. So while the ordinance would be something that is written into the statute, a bill on its merits, it's just, they would be separate things. It's just a bill.
So at this point, and this is just my feeling here, the applicant has put a motion out saying that he's fine, or they're fine with not putting these into all three of these not going into the record. Myself personally, I feel I can make a reasoned decision on the ample information that's in the record, and so I don't have a problem just knocking all three of these things out and starting getting into deliberation.
The other thing I want to verify is are they all three sitting in the same status? Like, are all three documents not actually in the record? Because I want to make sure we don't clump all three together, but there's one that's directly in the record.
That's correct. There's no exact copy of
Okay.
any of these three documents.
Thank you for clarification.
Okay, that's easier then.
So with that being said, I will move to strike all three of these documents from the record.
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor? Okay.
All right. So turning to the final set of documents, thank you for your patience. Jennifer Jonak. So she played a PowerPoint at the public hearing. The applicant did not object to the PowerPoint, but there are certainly pieces of the PowerPoint that are not in the record, including all the photographs that were included, the graphics, and the language in the PowerPoint, in my estimation, is echoed in the letter that she also submitted to the Planning Commission. So, although the applicant did not object to the PowerPoint, we do have to contend with the code provision that says no new evidence. So we could go through item by item through the PowerPoint. Staff's recommendation for the PowerPoint is that Planning Commission just reject it in its entirety, and then you can, if you choose to, you could dig into the letter a little bit more thoroughly.
So I have a question. One, and this may be for the commissioners that watched it on the video. Did Metro TV capture the PowerPoint on the video?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So that was just a question I had.
I move to reject the PowerPoint.
Second.
Discussion.
Yeah, I don't have any problem rejecting the PowerPoint. There's other photos in the record anyway, so it's not, these are not the only photos that are in the record, so.
Okay. Any other discussion? All those in favor? Okay, you guys didn't see anything that you saw.
Well, you won't consider the things that you saw.
Okay.
Ms. Jonak also submitted a highlighted copy of ORS 40.090 and an order authorizing the transfer of land from Lane County to the city of Eugene related to the deed that is in the record. The order itself is not in the record, nor is the copy of ORS 40.090. The applicant does not object to your consideration of either of those documents.
So I just have a procedural question. So the applicant doesn't have a problem with it.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's new evidence, does the commission have a problem with it?
Right, and that,
We don't be consistent.
And so.
that's exactly the right question.
Yeah, so,
I move to strike these two from the record.
I second it.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, the only question is Oregon revised statutes. Do we consider Oregon revised statutes law that we have to follow?
Commissioner Baker, I think they are law that you have to follow. The question, in this case, as I understand the discussion on the part of the Planning Commission, is whether when those types of things are presented to you, particularly with highlighting or underlining, if that's something that Planning Commission believes constitutes new evidence. And it sounds like previously the answer was yes, and Planning Commission wanted to be consistent.
Okay. Any other discussion? All those in favor? Okay.
And then finally, we have a letter from Jennifer Jonak to the Planning Commission. And let me turn to my copy of it. Again, the applicant has asked you to strike the letter in its entirety. Staff went through the letter to see if it raised concerns on the part of staff in terms of new evidence or arguments not raised before the hearings official. And Dan, maybe you can help me out. I believe that in terms of new evidence, we weren't too concerned. Is that great?
Right.
Okay.
Sure.
We felt like all of the kind of potential evidentiary statements were bolstered by evidence that was already in the record. There is what I believe to be a new argument about the city being required to balance public purpose of the existing trail and the destruction of it for an access road. I'm not sure that that was raised before the hearings official. Planning Commission could decide to reject that as a new argument. And then there's a fair amount of time spent talking about needed housing issues, which clearly are in the record, clearly were raised before the hearings official, but just for your information, again, are not, in my estimation, part of the appeal issues that are before you. So it's not a question of rejecting them as new evidence or new argument, but in terms of your final consideration of the appeal issues, I think they're outside the scope of the appeal issues.
Okay, any ideas on this one?
And Dan has kind of posted the paragraph that I was referring to that I believe could constitute an argument that was not raised before the hearings official. And Dan, if you feel differently, let me know.
No, so basically what this argument is saying is that when the city acquired the deed to parcel tax lot 301, that a balancing of public purposes was required, and that basically what Jennifer is saying is that balancing those public purposes and establishing the use for that parcel as a trail establishes use of that parcel, or establishes the public purpose as a trail kind of in perpetuity. That's not an argument that's been brought up in any of the appeal issues or in anywhere in the record.
But you think the rest of the letter is argument or testimony that is supported by what's in the record?
Correct, yeah. The rest relies on materials in the record.
So just for the new planning commissioners' knowledge, we do have the ability to pull out that paragraph. We've done similar things to that in the past. We pulled out, I think, a comma at one point. So if that's something that the commission feels is appropriate, we do have the ability to do that.
I move to remove this section that we can't find current evidence in the record of this information, and then a supportive argument.
Okay. Any other discussion? Okay.
And may I just clarify that what we're talking about rejecting is the paragraph on page 4 of the letter that begins.
we have-
Starting with the
paragraph right there.
decision.
The decision
ending
fails.
with the decision must fail.
Thank you.
Okay.
And it's only one paragraph.
Great, thank you.
All those in favor? Okay.
Great. I believe that is it. Thank you.
Okay, so with that being said, like I said earlier on, staff will compile these documents that we have left in the record and get them to us before our Thursday meeting so that if that for some reason they make a change to any of the decisions that you may make today, we can revisit those appeal issues and have another vote on them before we make our final decisions. That sound okay to everybody? All right. I think we're ready to start digging into the appeal issues, which is the reason that we're here. We've cleared the evidentiary parts, so we will dig into appeal issue number 1. Do we have that on the screen? And I'll just read it for the people watching at home. The hearings official erred regarding the applicability of the South Hill study as to this needed housing PUD application by confining the scope of the South Hill study to relate only to the density of the proposed development. As a result, the decision of the hearings official lacks consideration of factors expressed by the South Hill studies, except to support the findings that the EC 9.8325 subsection 2 is satisfied. I will open it up for discussion. Commissioner Randall and Commissioner Taylor.
I would support the hearings official's decision on this because the EC 98325 sub 2, the way I read it is the proposed land uses and densities within the PUD are consistent. And to me, that's those two items, and that's what the hearings official addressed and not the other items in the refinement plan. And then it goes on, if those are refined in any applicable refinement plan, but that's referring back to the land uses and densities.
Commissioner Taylor?
Yeah, I want to concur with Commissioner Randall. Also, just looking at the appellant's argument, if you look at the general standards versus the needed housing, there's clearly a differentiation of what needs to be met for refinement plans. So it's very clear that essentially it's very clear here that it's talking about proposed land uses and densities, which the hearings official addresses. So I would affirm her decision.
Anybody else want to speak to this? So at this
Or
point.
his decision, sorry, it's not Jenny this time.
No,
right?
it's his decision.
It's the last one, sorry about that.
Okay, so let's take a straw poll. The two of the commissioners have expressed that the hearings official did not err on assignment of error number 1. Would you agree with that? If you do so, raise your hand. So I've got unanimous on number 1, and that's a straw poll where we can always come back and revisit it. Okay. We will move on to, yes.
Commissioner Borowski, if I may, just for the new commissioners, the way that, at least I've seen Planning Commission kind of address appeal issues is to do what we just did, to have a discussion, take a straw poll, and then at the end of your decision, hopefully on Thursday, staff will bring you back a proposed final order that you'll have the chance to look at and let us know if you have any questions or concerns about the language of the proposed final order. And then we'll ask for a motion to adopt that final order, which should reflect the commission's polling on each of the appeal issues.
And again, for the new commissioners, it doesn't have to be unanimous. The straw polls don't have to be unanimous. It's just a majority of the commission has to move that forward. And then the final motion has to have a majority of the commission. So you can vote against this if you feel that it's not right. Okay. Next one is Appeal Issue 2. The hearings official erred in finding that EC 9.8325 subsection 4 satisfies as there is insufficient evidence to sustain the dispositive finding according to the applicable provision.
And this is related to tree preservation, or?
Right. Discussion on the tree issue.
Well,
Mr. Baker.
I don't really, I think, previous official didn't err, but we have another one of these situations where there's a requirement, but because we have a PUD that's only lots again, how does the tree preservation happen at the next level to be in compliance?
So the way the site plans are, it designates certain trees as to be removed or not to be removed. And so future lot owners going forward will have the option to go through the city's process for tree removal, which will take into account the characteristics of that tree in relation to the lot and other relevant considerations. So that's how it goes moving forward. However, trees to be removed, like it sounds, those will not be at the discretion of the lot owner. Those will be gone before the lot owner constructs.
Just whether that second phase is required, or you just submit a building permit, you actually have to go through a tree removal plan for an individual lot?
Yep.
Mr. Taylor?
Informational then.
And then,
I just wanted to, I noticed that the hearings official this time didn't have a condition of approval in terms of preservation, just during construction, kind of protecting during construction the trees that are to remain. So I think that's a possibility that could address the appellant's concerns, and it's a condition we often see in an application, because there are trees that aren't proposed to be removed, yet could be impacted in some way during construction, so making sure that they're preserved during. So I'm just asking, was there a reason why it wasn't included? Is there something we should consider, or is it something relevant for us today that we could consider?
I think just the reason that wasn't explicitly included is just because the code didn't explicitly require it, and reviewing the evaluation of the trees in different areas, we felt that just according to the language of the code, that it was met.
Okay.
That being said, there wasn't any specific hard reason against doing it. It was just that we believed the applicant had met the code requirement.
And just if I may
Yes.
jump in, just a reminder to the commission that in order to impose a condition of approval, you would first need to find that the approval criterion has not been met, and the only way to meet it is to impose the condition.
Yeah.
So you could.
Understood. Yeah, I got that, actually. I just wanted to make sure I understood what the communication was during the process and what your process was. I hear that. Thank you.
Commissioner Ramey.
Thank you. Very helpful about the next phase, because it's not actually at the owner's discretion. They have to get a permit, which may not allow them to do something they want. So it's not solely at their discretion, right?
Right, and I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good clarification. So what would be at the discretion of the lot owner is whether to try and go through the process of if they wanted trees removed to do it. But you're correct, they don't have absolute discretion at all
Right.
to decide whether the tree will be removed.
That didn't make sense to me as I read this, because I didn't think that was accurate, unless I didn't understand that PUD could overrule those other criteria, which doesn't sound like they can.
Right.
That's very helpful.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I appreciated Commissioner Taylor's comments, because the one area that it seemed like there might be some reason to consider a condition of protection would be where the road construction would impact some of the open space area, the buffer around the edge of that would be a potential area where you might impose tree protection to guarantee that this is met. That seems like the most logical place to do it, where there might be construction going on, and yet it's an area that's supposed to be a preservation.
Right.
Commissioner Taylor.
So, Commissioner Baker, I just want to clarify, I might have confused things. I mean, if you look at the criteria, we can't really do that. I was more curious about, okay, the appellants are coming back, what was the discussion during the hearings official? I notice sometimes you'll see that condition of approval. It's actually quite frequent, and what was the reason? So I just wanted you to know, I don't actually think, I kind of agree with staff and the hearings official, I don't think this code actually really addresses that or gives us that capacity.
Okay. So at this point, is there a will of the commission to affirm the hearings official's decision? If so, raise your hand for yes. Okay, 7-0. I'm just wondering, since we're going through these so quickly, do we want to do number 4 first and then come back to number 3? Because I think number 3 is going to be the more contentious. It's up to the body of the...
I think we should just go through in order.
Okay.
As long as, you know.
All right, we'll move on to number 3. Hearings official erred in finding that the proposed PUD does not run afoul of the prohibition on grading on slopes exceeding 20% contained in EC 9.8325 subsection 5. We'll open it up for discussion. Mr. Taylor.
I want to thank staff for the definition. That was helpful just in terms of looking at the definition of development and the inclusion of grading and excavating are separate activities. I think the hearings official does a good job. I mean, obviously, the definitions don't define each of those individually, but found a source that seems to be clear, so I would affirm the hearings official's decision.
So this is an interesting situation, and coming into it cold, I think it's helpful because you don't really understand. In fact, I was trying to figure out which way the slope went for a while. I had it backwards in my mind, but now I've got it straight. And knowing what I know about development, construction, and excavation and grading, I think the hearings official really got it right. I mean, I think if you think about it logically in the process of construction and even, again, what little I know about the intent of this, I think this is the right decision, and I think he worked based on the evidence in front of him to do that. And so I'm comfortable affirming his decision on this point, but I did give it a lot of thought. It was
Me
a
too.
very interesting situation.
I agree.
Commissioner Baker, then Commissioner Edwards.
Yeah, I disagree a bit because the way I understand, the word grading is in the South Hill study, and that's how we get that word. It doesn't have a definition there in that South Hill study for what grading is, so we're interpreting what that means. To me, what's planned is you're going to dig a hole, a trench. You're going to remove dirt. Either you're going to pile it on the site or remove it from the site and bring in fresh dirt. You're going to put your pipe down, then you're going to dump some dirt back down there, and then you're going to have to grade over that so that it's back to some similar slope to what it is. I can't conceive of how you can do that without doing some grading. I guess you could drop bits of sand one at a time from an egg timer, but I don't think that's the way construction happens. So I just can't see how physically you could install a pipe in a trench without doing some grading. And although the definitions are confusing, and hopefully maybe that'll get cleared up in the code update, I think the purpose was to prevent damage to the roots of trees and things that would potentially cause movements of soil. So I just can't quite agree with the hearings official's definition based upon the dictionary.
Commissioner Edwards.
I tended to support the hearing official's decision because I did see, obviously, that excavation and grading were two different things. I see that excavation is almost nearly impossible without some sort of altering, at least at a temporary level, but that to me, and it was mentioned in the evidence, that grading was intended to be a permanent change to the slope. So to me, that was, I felt that that was consistent with the hearings official.
Mr. Taylor.
Yeah, I wanted to echo, because I think it's important, I echo what Commissioner Ramey said. This was the hardest one for me as well. I'm very sensitive to what Mike Reeder, the applicant's legal counsel, brought up, just in terms of clear and objective, and because of the 19 rule law. I mean, we were involved in that, and just paying attention and thoughtful. And so I spent a lot of time on this. Commissioner Baker brings something up. I was like, of course. This is really coming from the refinement plan. So actually that definition in the code, in terms of what I was looking for, is there any clear, because isn't this one, there should be, oh no, but it's adopted within the code, it's chapter 9. Thank
So
you.
it comes specifically from the
That's right.
code
Thank you.
criteria.
Thank
I mean,
you.
to the extent it's
That's right.
referred to in the South Hill study.
That's right. That's right.
Those policies
No,
are not invoked.
that's what I just needed, is that reminder, because I thought that the other day, he said that, and I was like, oh, should I rethink that? But you're right. Okay, so I'm not going to change that comment. So, perfect. Thanks.
I put myself in the queue. Yeah, I had some issues with this, and it went beyond whether excavating is grading or not grading. It jumped the next level to, is that clear and objective? And we went through that when we had the deliberation on the 19 lot rule during the Walker. And what it came down to is we, as a commission, said that we didn't think that that was clear and objective, or we thought it was clear and objective, and Luba said it wasn't, as I recall, the 19 lot rule. And what was brought up was that is not our purview. If we want to make a change to the code, that is changing the code. And so for us to say that, for me, when there's apprehension, that seems like it's not clear and objective, but that's not my decision. I learned that in the Walker one.
Can I
Yes.
clarify or
Yes.
make sure I understand your
Yeah.
comment, Commissioner Borowski? So, the City Council is the only body with authority to adopt code provisions, to change code provisions, or to decide not to apply code provisions. Staff doesn't have that authority, and neither does Planning Commission. The City Council has adopted a series of clear and objective standards that apply to what we call needed housing PUDs. And so the question in front of the Planning Commission tonight is not whether this approval criterion is clear and objective. Planning Commission doesn't have the ability to decide, we don't think it is, so we're not going to apply it. It is applicable because it's in the city code, and the Planning Commission doesn't have the authority to kind of waive code requirements. The question for Planning Commission is, are excavation and grading the same thing? Do you feel that the approval criterion is met? And if you do, great. And if you don't, that is also your prerogative. I mean, that's the decision that is before the Planning Commission. So
Right.
Did the application comply with the approval criterion?
Right. And so that's kind of, she said it much better than I could have, because that's where I would have gone on this. And I've learned that I can't go there. And so my next decision is excavating, grading. That is within my purview to decide whether the hearings official defined that correctly. And I believe that digging a trench is not grading. And so I can live with the hearings official's decision. Commissioner Baker.
And my concern was just that you're doing more than excavating. I mean, you obviously can't lay a pipe and just excavate a hole and then drop the pipe in. You're doing some things after that. So although the applicant may call it excavating, there's other activities that have to go on aside from just digging a hole. So that to me was the concern. So, you know, if it were truly just digging a hole and nothing else, just digging a hole, then maybe, you know, I would have had a different interpretation, but I can't see how you can lay a pipe and cover it up and do that just excavating.
Commissioner Baker, I don't know that this gets to your concern, but to the extent that it influences the Planning Commission's decision, I did want to remind the Planning Commission that the hearings official also did impose a condition of approval that requires that prior to any activity that would develop, as defined by EC 9.0500, which includes both excavation, which would include excavation. Any portion of the subject property shown with areas of slope at 20% or greater, the applicant shall provide a profile of the existing grade line for the area within which an activity to develop is proposed, and a plan to demonstrate how the grade line will be retained or otherwise restored following the development activity.
Commissioner Randall.
Well, and I think that's where I fall too, because like it or not, the code section says there shall be no proposed grading on portions. It doesn't say there shall be no proposed excavating or no proposed trenching or no proposed whatever. It says no proposed grading. And grading, in the absence of a definition specific in the code, we go back to Webster or, you know, dictionary, which is that slope and retaining that slope. And I think the condition that the hearings official imposed protects it that way. Now, whether we think, you know, sub 5 is the way it should be worded or not is unfortunately irrelevant, because that's the
approval criteria.
Yeah, the approval criteria. That's the approval criteria, and the approval criteria says grading. It doesn't say grading, excavating, and trenching.
Commissioner Fragola.
Yeah, I think this appeal was the most difficult one for me also, and my thought process went similar to yours, Chair Borofsky, in that, you know, that whole conversation around clear and objective, but I understand that that's not what we're looking at, that's City Council's position. And I think ultimately what helped clarify the grading versus excavation for me was the condition that the hearing official applied, because it seems like there is the intent that the grade will not be changed during the excavation process. And I am going to assume, based on my own personal knowledge of other departments in the city that also work to make sure that construction is implementing erosion control measures as well, that, you know, that all comes into play as well, and that therefore the grading, it seems to me that the hearing official ruled accurately.
Commissioner Taylor.
Before I had that lapse when Commissioner Baker said that, and I was like, wait, is that I go back to the definition, and that's an important one. The definition of development actually takes those two words, excavation and grading, are discretely different. So it specifically calls out under development grading as something discrete. So with everything we're saying, it's fairly clear that it's, yeah.
Okay, is there anybody who would like to make a motion on this? Or not a motion, but
Yeah, we can,
one way or another?
we can do it.
All right, all those who feel that the hearings official did not err on assignment of error number 3, raise your hand. And those opposed? 6-1. Okay. Now we'll move on to appeal issue number 4. Hearings official erred in extending the right-of-way designation of tax lot 301 to encompass a roadway, which by extension formed the basis for the erroneous findings that EC 9.3256 is satisfied. Commissioner Taylor.
I think the hearings officially did not err. So staff comments in this particular document, it's noted in other places in the record, but on page 9 of RAIS, staff comments has a specific section of the deed, the lot's deed, and it specifically says that the property was conveyed by this grant, require with road funds of Lane County, and hereby accepts the legal obligation and restrictions of use of the property for public road purposes as provided for under Oregon law in this grant. There is other supportive evidence, but that one is, to me, very clear. And it is a road being proposed, and that's for public use. So, seems great. So I don't think he erred.
Commissioner Baker.
I don't think he erred either, but I do think it's, this is just, it's awkward and it's not ideal. Prior, go back to the record, prior Parks Department officials sort of promised that this would be a shared use path, and the current Parks official says, no, it's no longer the case. Well, that's certainly in the purview. And then you also have information in the record that you're not supposed to connect a local street to East 30th. It's only supposed to be collectors or arterials that could connect to it. So it's. I mean, I don't think given the evidence, I don't think the hearings official erred, but I do think it's not an ideal solution, and it could conceivably be blocked at some later state when they get to the transportation permits to connect to 30th, and there's some other issues that come up. So again, that's my concern, but I don't think it's the hearings official error given the statements in the record.
So Commissioner Baker, I'm not sure that you're implying this, but I just want to ask Dan to be very clear for Planning Commission and those watching at home. My understanding is that the proposal is specifically not to connect to 30th, at least at this point. Is that?
Yeah, that's correct. It's not to complete this.
No, but it's to connect to 30th at all. In other words,
Somewhere down the line?
No. It's for this street to connect to 30th, even if it's just this little short piece. You're not supposed to connect anything but collectors or arterials to 30th based upon the information in the record from previous transportation comments from various transportation officials. So, and now we're doing exactly that. We're connecting a local street to 30th Avenue.
There will be no connection.
Pardon?
There will not be a connection. They're not developing the street all the way to 30th.
That's correct.
So,
30th Avenue.
okay, so I think what the confusion around here is that there will not be a connection between 30th Avenue and 29th Central Ave.
Right.
That's correct.
Right. That's true. But there's still a connection to 30th. It's a local street rather than a.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood what you were saying.
Yeah.
And that's not supposed to be happening.
Okay.
Mr. Ramey.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to help them get to the conclusion. They're talking about two different
They're
things.
two different.
You're both right.
Yeah. And go ahead.
And I'll just say, with Commissioner Baker, again, a new kid on the block, you get to say maybe dumb things every once in a while, but this is sort of a heartstring issue. I mean, it's sort of like, wow, it's almost like, well, what happened here? Because you read the history of what happened, and you look at the drawings and go, well, that's too bad, but that's the record. I mean, I'm sorry, that's the evidence before us, which is the deed, and it's supposed to be a public right-of-way, and we can't do anything about that. So the hearings official acted on that deed and acted correctly, although not something probably each of us, were we in another environment like Commissioner Baker, we'd go, not so sure. But given the confines of the hearing and the evidence, I believe the hearings official was correct in his determination.
I put myself in the queue and then Commissioner Taylor. Yeah, I think that's one of the main fears of the neighbors is that that this road's going to go through to Capitol, and that's been brought up in the record numerous times, and it is, they've been told things over and over again. okay, E-Web's coming in, we're never gonna put a road through here. Okay, so, all right, fine. Now, development comes through, well, we gotta put a road halfway through here. And then, somewhere down the line, well, the fire department says we need to put a road through here, and the road's will end up going through there. And so it's a trust issue from the neighbors, because they've been told things by the city repeatedly over years, and that's, been brought up in many emails that are in the record. And so it's a legitimate concern, it's like, no, we're not going to do that. No, we're not going to do that. And things keep progressing that way. So it's a valid concern. I don't think it's in our purview to deny it on those concerns, but the neighbors have, in my opinion, have legitimate concerns about opening that through, because the concern that they have is, once you open that through, that's 30th Avenue to the university. And we've already seen the transportation issues on those unimproved streets, and it would be harmful. It would not be a safe and thing. So that is a true concern, but I don't think we're in a position to stop it. So, Commissioner Taylor?
I just wanted to, Commissioner Ramey, because of the way you started, I actually think that isn't, how you said it's kind of because of your new position. I feel that all the time, actually. There's pieces of this PUD I would have liked some additional information. I think that we are limited to what's in front of us, and reiterating that over and over is really important, that we have a role and we are serving a specific quasi-judicial role in this place, so we are limited. So it doesn't mean that we don't, that there isn't this piece of, obviously, some communication with staff, that there were other objectives but in the record it clearly says it's for use for public road. So just always, I think, reminding the public what our role is, and this, we want to follow it, because that's our responsibility in the oath that we took today. So no, I don't think it's new. I think it's something actually to constantly remind ourselves and remind the public. Yeah.
Commissioner Fragola, Randall, and then Baker.
Yeah, I think, based on the decision that we are required to make today, that the hearings official, didn't err on this appeal, but I did find it concerning. I mean, this is a space that the community uses. It connects the North and the South Trail system. The community has obviously put time and effort and heart into maintaining it. And, when we're thinking about the type of community we want, I don't know the history of how the decision got made to turn that lot over to making it a road. But I do think it's important that we preserve these spaces. And so I don't think that's the decision we have to make today. And, I would just like to say on the record that it saddens me that that piece will disappear for the community.
Mr. Randall.
Well, kind of getting to what Commissioner Taylor was saying, I have to tell myself that on these sorts of things all the time, that we have especially on appeals, we have a very narrow viewpoint that we can take. And regardless, again, it's as the oaths were without bias and that, or, what we're charged with is to what's in the record, what was there, and what the code says, and whether we like what the code says, whether we like what's in the record is irrelevant. We have to base our decision on that information. It's very narrow oftentimes. And so, that's what we're charged to do, and that's the way the law is written. And so I think, in this instance, 25 years ago, Lane County and City of Eugene made an agreement, and it said for a public road. And whether we like that or not, is frankly irrelevant, because that's what's in the deed, and whether
Mr.
it's
Baker.
unfortunate or not.
Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I'd like to make a correction. The deed doesn't say for a public road, it says for a public purpose. And
That
that's,
says public road.
Actually, it says,
Public road purposes.
okay, well, there are other places where it just says public
Yeah,
purpose.
but this is the
yeah,
actual deed.
it's
So,
Okay.
you know,
in several forms.
I just wanted to say, from my point of view, that was not the convincing piece of evidence, because very often things are bought with road funds and are used for other purposes. But the convincing evidence is with Mr. Carnahan, the Parks Director, says they're not going to want it for parks and public works. You know, it's for a road. So that was the convincing part for me, not the deed itself, because the deed is from a long time ago, and we use road funds all the time for other purposes. I mean, if you look all the way around to Eugene, road funds, end up sometimes being used in parks.
I'm going to put myself in the queue. Just as somebody who has been on the street bond panel for the last 12 years or 10 years, road funds are very prescriptive as to what you can use them for. The monies are curb to curb, or acquisitions. So to say that we're using road funds for parks, I don't think is a correct statement. I've been trying to use road funds for a lot of different things over the years in my position on the budget committee and other positions that I've been in, and have always been pretty much shot down. Road funds are paid for with state gas taxes, and there's state statutes that are very specific as to how those funds can be used, so.
I just want to, Commissioner Baker, so this quote is taken from page 2 of the deed. If you look at the deed of the property,
Okay.
it actually is the third item, so there's a sentence, and then it's the third paragraph. So it's coming straight out of the deed.
Okay, well, I saw some copies that I thought that just said public purposes.
No, it's actually, if you look in the record, the actual deed, yeah.
Commissioner Randall?
and frankly, and unfortunately, deed restrictions are why we still don't have a city hall.
Yeah, I mean, they're not insignificant. I mean, they,
That was cheap.
It's one of the reasons we may not have a city hall.
One of the reasons.
But
Okay. Anybody else want to speak to this, or are we in a position where we can take a poll to affirm the hearings official's decision? Okay. All those in favor of affirming the decision, raise your hand. Okay. So staff, talk us through our next steps here, if you would, please.
Okay. So next steps will be, at the next hearing, we'll prepare a final draft order that will set out what evidence was stricken, and that will be apparent in the draft order. We'll also create language that would accommodate the straw polls that just happened, and on Thursday we'll finalize with a motion to affirm or not affirm the hearings official.
The Thursday meeting is at 11:30 over at Harris Hall.
Okay. Mr. Baker?
Well, there's a draft order here already, right?
Correct. And yeah, that draft is still subject to modification based on what just happened in this meeting.
You'll see, Commissioner Baker, there are a few placeholders in the draft order that was provided to you for this evening's meeting because you had all those procedural issues to go through and we didn't know exactly what Planning Commission would do. So staff needs to kind of fill in those pieces, and then we'll provide you with a proposed final order without the draft watermark for Thursday.
Commissioner Randall?
So Thursday has the potential to be a short meeting then,
It does have a potential to
based
be a
on
short
what we've
meeting.
discussed tonight.
Okay. With that being said, moving on to Thursday's agenda, I did talk to staff about possibly pulling one of the items from the following meeting where we've got 5 agenda items. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that. There's a possibility that there's a discussion about the membership to the ETAC. We might get into that, but we probably won't. One of the things that I would suggest to staff is, a lot of times at our meetings, we are very limited on the last agenda item, which is items from commission and staff. So maybe we put 15 minutes or something on that. Since we're all going to be there and have to show up, maybe that would be a good opportunity for Robin and other staff to bring items that we kind of short circuit at a lot of our other meetings because they're so full, just to utilize the attention of the commission. Does that sound okay? All right. Anything else that you need to bring up, staff or commissioners? Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you to our new commissioners for going through this with us. Welcome to the appeal part of your duties as planning commissioners. And with that, we are adjourned.